youngest son and a member of the local parish choir, had to witness the whole event and sing while the ceremony was going on and the slow tolling of the bell. And as the coffin was lowered into the grave, he and his fellow choristers sang Luther's words, mitten wir im Leben sind, in the midst of life we're in death. His whole world must have collapsed.
His first wife was to die at the age of just 35. Even in an age of high infant mortality, of his 20 children, only 10 were to reach adulthood. After his parents died, Sebastian and his elder brother Jakob went to live with a sibling they hardly knew, Johann Christoph, 14 years older than Sebastian. He was the church organist at Ohrdruf, only 30 miles up the road, but it could have been a world away. I've come across documents in the local archives that show that conditions in Sebastian's school in Ohrdruf were every bit as deplorable as in the one he'd left behind in Eisenach. Ruffianism and loutish behaviour were rife here too, and there was a sadistic teacher. But curiously, Bach's grades improved.
Bach was the youngest son of quite a big family, and then suddenly he lost both parents before his 10th birthday, and he then went to live with his elder brother. How much of a trauma can that have been for him?
What you're describing is a triple bereavement. There's losing the parents, there's losing the home, new town, new place. I'd say that is pretty difficult for any child. We do have a lot of research showing that this kind of early bereavement and uprooting can scar people for life.
Do you think his school grades are relevant and interesting here? Because when he was in Eisenach, when he was still with his parents, he played truant an awful lot. After he moves into his elder brother's house, his school grades rocket. They go way up. So there's a big change there. Do you think that's to do with the orphanhood?
Again, I'm speculating, but what I'm hearing here is that there was a horrible, horrible environment in the school, but maybe there was a little bit of protection from the home. Then he loses the home. So now the whole world is a dog-eat-dog situation. There's only one person he can rely on, and that's himself, which would explain why he has to be good at school now, doesn't he? He has to, because basically, if you show weakness, if you are weak, you suffer and you go under.
At the age of 15, Bach was awarded a singing scholarship at a school in Lüneburg, 230 miles to the north. He walked the whole way with a school friend, Georg Erdmann, who would re-enter the Bach story 30 years later. Bach spent 3 years in Lüneburg from the age of 15 to 18. His voice would have broken almost as soon as he got there. So what was he doing in the meantime? This is one of the great puzzles of Bach's life. One thing we do know is that while he was at Lüneburg, Bach was acquainted with one of Germany's leading musical figures, Georg Böhm, a composer and a renowned organist, also born in Thuringia, like Bach himself. This is a letter that Carl Philipp Emanuel wrote to Bach's first biographer, Johann Nicholas Forkel, telling him all the bits and pieces that he could remember about his father. And the particularly interesting thing here is when he refers to his former teacher, Georg Böhm, he crosses it out. Why, having written that Böhm was his father's teacher, did Emanuel think better of it and erase the reference? In 2005, a suggestive new clue came to light. Some leaves of organ tablature, for many years wrongly catalogued in a German library, were rediscovered by Leipzig Bach archivist Michael Maul.
When I read the Latin phrase at the end of the manuscript, copied after a manuscript of Georg Böhm in the year of 1700 in Lüneburg. And I know one person who was in 1700 in Lüneburg and was very interested in very good organ music, and that's the young J.S. Bach. After comparing the manuscript with the other examples, we can be absolutely sure that no one else than Bach is the writer of these manuscripts.
I mean, this is the missing piece in the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it says that he wrote this on paper belonging to Georg Böhm. So he went and maybe became a student or an apprentice to Georg Böhm.
Yes.
And under his supervision wrote out this very difficult piece, which proves that he played this music. So he was already a virtuoso.
Did Emanuel suddenly remember that his father, for some reason, didn't wish his relationship with Georg Böhm to be known?
Did he acknowledge that he learned from other people? Did he acknowledge their greatness?
This is fascinating because when he made remarks about possible teachers, his son Emanuel just erased them. So Bach didn't want that to be known. He wanted everybody to know that he'd done it entirely on his own, off his own bat.
If he had this assumption that you have got to have power and you should never show weakness, he would be very poor in acknowledging those sources.
At the age of 18, Bach, as well as being a virtuoso organist, was a competent violinist. In 1703, he left Lüneburg to return to the family stamping ground. In Arnstadt, only 30 miles from where Sebastian was born, the city fathers had put a tax on beer in order to pay for a brand new organ for the Neue Kirche. Bach was hired to test the new organ and then to play it in audition in front of the thirsty citizens. He landed the job on more money than his father had ever earned. But there was a catch. The council insisted that he provide new music. All he had at his disposal was a ragtag and bobtail band made up of mature students. Thus Bach began his career as a composer, but not in exactly auspicious circumstances.
He wrote a cantata, his first, in which there's a very important bassoon obbligato, a solo for the bassoon in 3 of the movements. It was a banana skin.
The bassoon part starts innocuously enough, honking away at a steady old lick. But then comes a bassoonist's worst nightmare.
In the space of about 2.5 bars, he sends the bassoon through a whole list of different keys involving very, very, very complicated fingerings.
Deliberately or not, Bach had set a trap for his resident bassoonist.
He was writing for a fellow called Bach, who, in rehearsal, made a complete hash of it. And Bach was exasperated to the point when he called him a Zippelfagottist, which can be translated variously as a nanny goat bassoon or a greenhorn bassoon. But in reality, Bach was calling him a prick.
Yet another translation is bassoonist breaking wind after eating a green onion. However Bach understood the term, he didn't like what he was hearing.
The insult clearly rankled, and Bach plotted his revenge. And he and his cronies, well-oiled after a party christening, sat in wait for Bach, here in the town square. Bach was making his way back from playing music at the castle, Nidec Castle, and was taken completely by surprise. And Bach came up to him and demanded an apology, and then took his cudgel and hit Bach smack across the face. Bach, in self-defense, drew his rapier, and there was a scuffle, a major scuffle, and it was only the other students who eventually stopped the whole thing.
No doubt to Bach's fury, the church council sided with Bach, according to the records. And that was far from the last of the problems. Bach was accused of introducing strange harmonies into his organ music, which upset the old dears of the parish. He played either far too long or not long enough, and he'd slipped off down to the pub. Once, he smuggled a strange girl into his organ loft to make music. The final straw came when he asked for 4 weeks' leave to visit the renowned organist Buxtehude, walking the whole 260 miles up to Lübeck. In fact, he was away 4 months, not 4 weeks, and was airily dismissive when he was asked to explain himself. what we now see is patterns of behavior that had their origins in the unhealthy environment of his early schooling, first in Eisenach and then in Ohrdruf. Patterns of anger, patterns of dealing with authority in a very surly and uncompromising way, impatience, and a kind of self-assuredness that was bound to rub people up the wrong way.
Bach is commemorated in Arnstadt by this curious recent statue in Jack the Lad pose, perhaps in a nod to his feisty and fractious stay here. His time in Arnstadt came to an end when in 1707 he was offered a new post 50 miles up the road in Mühlhausen. The city had been thriving, but it was Bach's bad luck to arrive just after a disastrous fire had wreaked havoc in the city. Caught up in a local dispute between the clergy, Bach moved on in less than a year. But two significant things happened. First, aged 22, he married his cousin, Maria Barbara. And then he wrote one of the most important documents we have. Here's a letter that Bach wrote to the Mühlhausen town council explaining the reasons why he handed in his resignation. And the interesting thing from our point of view is that he defines his Endzweck, as he called it, his final ambition, his goal in life. The key phrase is, a well-regulated church music to the glory of God. Germany was on the brink of the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution had been in full swing for over a century, but superstition was still rife. Here, as late as the 1730s, witches were being burnt at the stake. The 30 Years' War had ended in 1648, and in its wake came a strong revival of Lutheranism. Bach took it upon himself to lay down the New and the Old Testament commandments with renewed force. In 1708, Bach left Mühlhausen for the elegant court of Weimar. This was a real turning point. For the first time in his life, he was able to call on good quality musicians. But as so often in his career, there was a snag. In fact, there were two of them. Weimar was ruled by a pair of dukes, an uncle and nephew team. It was a recipe for disaster. The musicians were employed by both, but the uncle made it known to the musicians that if they played for his nephew, they would be liable to be flogged, dismissed out of hand. In fact, there was one poor horn player who was dismissed on the spot, flogged, and then eventually hung as an example, terrible example to all the other musicians, what would happen if they stepped out of line. One might imagine that in such a fraught, tense situation, nothing creative could have come out of Bach's time in Weimar, but of course the opposite is true. It was a hugely stimulating time for him. His first encounter with the Italian music of Vivaldi and of Corelli and so on. And from Bach's own compositional activity, it was an enormously important time. We got the beginnings of his really, really important keyboard works. And not only that, his cantatas, amazing cantatas that he started to write for Weimar, for the Kapelle, and performed up in the Himmelsburg. Originally, a cantata was a small, intimate Italian piece for a solo voice and a couple of instruments. But soon it was taken over by German composers in the century before Bach and was associated with the Lutheran liturgy. But by the time Bach came along, it had grown into something almost gargantuan. His 200 pieces last anything from 25 to 30 minutes each, occupied a place somewhere between the reading of the lesson and the sermon, and they reflected the theme of the day, as it were.
You pity the unfortunate preacher who had to follow music as eloquent as this.
Siehe, siehe, ich stehe vor der Tür und klopfe an, so jemand meine Stimme hören wird und die Tür auftun, zu dem werde ich eingehen und das Abendmahl mit ihm halten und er mit mir.
Bach demonstrates his fantastic ability to set a scene, in this case, Jesus knocking at the door of the human heart.
Bach wrote more than 20 cantatas in Weimar, but having proved his early mastery of the form, he suddenly stopped. The court's musical director had died, and when the resulting vacancy was filled by his son, a musical nullity, and not by Bach, his reaction was to down tools. He simply stopped composing. It went from bad to worse. When Bach asked to leave his employ, the fiery Wilhelm Ernst had him thrown into jail. Bach thus became one of the few composers in history to do hard time. Some of his music, technically the property of his employer, may have stayed on at Weimar. 70 years later, the Himmelsburg burnt to the ground.